Hello and welcome to the i3 podcast, Conversations with Institutional Investors. My name is Wouter Klijn and I'm the Director of Content for the Investment Innovation Institute. For more information about our educational forums for institutional investors, please visit our website at www.i3, that's the number 3-invest.com. There you can also subscribe to our complimentary newsletter, i3 Insights, in which we discuss investment strategy and asset allocation questions with asset owners from around the world. Now, as you all know, we love our disclaimers in this industry, so here's ours. This recording is for educational purposes only. It does not constitute financial advice and is intended for institutional and wholesale investors only. Please enjoy the show. Welcome to the i3 podcast, Conversations with Institutional Investors. I'm here today with Ben Darwin, who is the co-founder and general manager of corporate at Gainline Analytics. And today's topic is a little bit different from our normal investment-focused podcast because we're going to take a look at what makes teams successful and stay successful. So Ben is a former Wallaby, having played 28 test matches for Australia. He's a former coach and a performance analyst, having worked with a number of rugby teams, including a Japanese team, the NTT Shining Arcs, and Suntory Sungoliath. He started Gainline in 2013 out of a desire to introduce a greater degree of empirical analysis into professional sports. But his research goes broader than just sports. It also goes into the dynamics of professional teams across industries and the cultures they foster. So in this podcast, we're going to have a look at how this has implications for investment teams and also for super fund organizations. So Ben, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much.
So tell me a little bit about the origin story behind Gainline. I just mentioned why you started it, but can you tell us a little bit about the history of it?
I suppose I have to begin in a way, and I apologise to go back, but with my own history, in that not being Australian and coming from the UK, I always sort of had I've always felt like a bit of an outsider in my view of the world. And becoming sort of then part of Australian rugby, I was always confused by this idea of like, people say to me, I'd go to the UK, oh geez, they breed them big in Australia. Actually, I was born in Crewe in the Midlands, like I'm not even from Australia. And they would say, you Australians, you're so good at sport and things. And I'd be like, I don't quite understand why. And so I was always interested by this idea about Australian sport punching above its weight and why rugby particularly punched above its weight, and also why countries like England or France, for that matter, or just generally larger countries would have all the resources in the world and not necessarily be as successful. And I remember a particular phrase by Peter Fitzsimons talking about England coming out to play and thinking, is this the best they can put together? Because they have 1 million rugby players, for example, in England, roughly. I think we have 60,000. So it's like, how's this taking place? So as a player coming into that environment, I was a little bit confused by it. And then you become, one of the problems with sport is we all see things so magically. We all see, and we see individuals as heroes and not sort of think of them as everyday people. So you then sort of become part of that environment and you meet the coaches and you meet people as part of the system and think, wow, like, how is this successful? It doesn't make sense. And not that people aren't talented, but the people you're up against being just as talented, if not more talented, and not understanding why. So then I became a coach because I had a spinal injury in 2003. So I got very young into coaching. And the first club I was ever a part of, I don't think I won a game as a coach. So I'm like, okay, I'm a terrible coach. And then I went to another club, which was the Western Force, which was a startup team, and we didn't win anything. And then I went to Japan and didn't lose for 2 years. Then I come back and coach somewhere else and win there. And then I coached again in Japan and didn't lose, and thinking, okay, maybe it's just me in Japan. But then I'd have other teams in Australia do well or poorly. So I began to understand that my influence on a team was sometimes good, sometimes bad, but that didn't necessarily lead to outcomes. And I've got to say probably my worst coaching I ever did was in a team that did not lose the whole year. It's almost like I was trying to derail them. Yeah. And almost did derail them, to be honest. But they won despite me. And once you bounce around enough organizations, you start to kind of see some causality around performance. And sometimes teams win with good coaches. Sometimes they win despite good coaches. sometimes they lose with good coaches. And you talk to enough people with enough experience, they'll tend to tell you the same thing. So the last team I was part of from a coaching perspective, I also became a data analyst. And that was the Melbourne Rebels. And that one of the questions they asked me was after 2 years, because we spent a lot more than the market. We basically spent double what the market had in terms of talent, but we didn't win a lot of games. Yeah. And so the question came up for me as an analyst, how long is it going to take for us to win? So that question led me down this path. And I did one more stint, of coaching at Suntory, like I said, and I came back to Australia and basically started the business because I didn't want to work in sport anymore because I could not control the outcomes at all.
Yeah.
The team, the last job I had as a coach, I was literally fired after we went undefeated. So I'm like, okay, bugger this. This is not working. So Gainline is basically a consultancy company because you see a lot of people in sport, when they lose their jobs or in business, they become a consultant to kind of fill the time. This is basically that option. It's just gotten out of hand. But it's a stopgap that's gotten out of hand now for 13 years.
Yeah, it's got out of hand in a good way.
Yeah, in a good way. So that's kind of how I arrived at that point. But the original idea for the business was actually not Cohesion Analytics, as we call it. It was actually something entirely different, which was a model whereby clubs would come to us and we would tell them who was off contract. And the way I arrange the data is I always arrange the data visually, so I could just easily find a player. And I arrange them by team, but I would couple all the players in that team together, and then I would notice contractual changes year to year between teams. And there was one particular team that basically came to us and said, we want to gut the whole team. Can you help us find new players? And we tried to help them do that. And then they came back and said, we're really sorry, the owner's got financial problems. We have to keep the players we don't want. So we knew what they wanted and didn't want, and it wasn't what they had they didn't want. And the next year they went from, I believe, second last in the year they came to us, and the next year they made the finals for the first time. And I don't think they've made the finals since. So this one year where they stabilized because of an external force, which was the financials, made them keep the players they didn't want. They dramatically improved. And I'm like, okay, that does not make sense. And then there was another example at the same time in 2013 of a team called the Highlanders in Super Rugby, who had a recent period of underperformance, and they were gifted through New Zealand Rugby a large amount of players who've been highly successful at the 2011 World Cup. And the market responded by saying, okay, look how much talent they have. So they went, I believe, from 40-1, so a 2% chance of winning the competition, to 6-1, which put them as favourites, second favourites. And they won 3 games, including losing to the Rebels, which generally gets you fired as a coach, right? But that team 2 years later, without most of those guys, then won the comp. So I was really confused now and it was almost running against my own self-interest, because we were trying to help players go into the marketplace. And what it was saying was, don't buy talent. Yeah. Hold on to the talent you don't want. And so the more that people they imported, the less they could do. So the more people imported, the worse they got, and the less they imported, the better they got. So I started to run analysis on this and just built some very simple algorithms, one called TWI, which the acronym I'll regret forever, particularly in financial services, but that's what we've got. And we just started to find some commonality, and then we found weaknesses in that system. And then it's been a continuous iteration ever since on this kind of formula for success or failure. And then teams started talking to us. But the core of that research was not out of sport. It was out of Grossberg's work on portability talent. It was around military data on shared experience. It was around hospital research on contractual stability. It was on other military research around structure and size of teams. And we just then applied it to sport, and then it came back again, where we've taken it back to corporate again. But we just found it to be particularly long-term, really strongly predictable on performance, but also we felt was getting to the heart of causality, because a lot of data in financial services and in the sports industry is fundamentally measuring outcomes, measuring performance, but what we're trying to get to the heart of is what's causing that performance.
Yeah.
So we're not really interested in the scenario of like a company is selling this much more. What we're interested in is, why are they selling this much more, or why are they having performance? So we're trying to remove ourselves from form. And the turn of phrase I use to that is the closer what we're finding is the closer you would get to correlation, the further you would move from causation.
Yeah.
Two things are so tied. And I'll give a very simple example of this in sport. In rugby, the team that makes the most line breaks or gets the most run meters will generally win the game. Okay. Well, that's pretty close to tries scored because you can't really score tries without making line breaks. So why don't we just say the team with the highest score wins the game? Okay. But that's really not getting to the heart of causation at all. Let's go right further back. Why are they catching the ball? Why are they able to pass the ball? Let's keep coming back to the core of that. Why the skills of the players develop so well? And so what we're really trying to do is to move entirely away from form, because form has no heart in causation.
Yeah. Yeah, you touch upon something there that I thought was interesting as well. You did a presentation for us at our strategy forum in May, and you were talking about this concept of spending a lot of money on talent is actually not necessarily helping the team perform better. And I sort of made a comparison there with investment teams where you often have a star investor or a star fund manager. But if you take them out and put them in a different team, in a different company, they don't always perform as well or are as successful either. And you talked a lot about cohesion within a team. Can you tell us a little bit about what do you mean by cohesion and how do you develop it?
So that turn of phrase, and all of these pretty much terms have been used, brought up by other people, but the turn of phrase attribution bias I really like, which is we overly attribute performance to the individual, either successful or unsuccessful, to the individual rather than the collective of the situation that person's performing in. So what we're trying to do is to understand what are the drivers of that individual performance. And so we know that a player is much more likely to perform well when, for example, in rugby, you have a 9-10 combination, a passer and a catcher. If that passer has been passing to that person 9,000 times before, they're going to know where to put the ball. Okay. In financial services, for example, you might have a researcher relationship between a researcher and a fund manager, and that researcher knows how to deliver the information effectively and can use all of the terms and phrases that we like, and can get to a shorthand or can look for the keys that this person's really interested in. Well, that's just a relationship that can work much faster and cover off more detail, and we also like how the things are handed to us. So whatever form this takes, whether it be sport or corporate, I don't really see too much of a difference. So what I'm trying to do in cohesion is I'm trying to measure the attributes which directly drive understanding between people. And there's different forms of understanding. So that understanding could either be interpersonal understanding, it could be system understanding, it could be role understanding, and then things like size of a team, which we can touch on later on. Then structure, which is extremely important, how different parts interact. In fact, there's a group I did some work with in Sydney, was a asset management company, and they had different divisions in the business and realized the different divisions were not talking to each other. And another one would make a change and the other one would say, why didn't you tell us this was going to take place? This is going to completely stuff our systems up. And they were like, we didn't even think of talking to you about this, right? And I mean, I've done work with an almond manufacturing company that had the same problem, right? It doesn't, systems are systems are systems. And of course, there's different nuances to each scenario, but we all misattribute what change does in its many forms. And so cohesion is fundamentally trying to measure change as well as the level of understanding between the component parts of a team. So if I look at a team, and we've done work with Platinum, for example, the Platinum team has a level of measurable understanding that we can map at any one point, and it's shifting all the time, up, down. And when a team doesn't change, it's shifting. So if you and I do something, if we do this podcast, there'll be misunderstandings. We do it again, and you'll go, Ben, yesterday I heard about this, but I want to talk more about this. Or you might say, I know when Ben's talking too long, or, I know with my wife, for example, when the left eyebrow goes up, that's a dishwasher related issue, right? We have this shorthand that we all misunderstand, right? If I could give you a really easy example of this, and I didn't present this at the thing, but I was in the supermarket one day, and I normally shop at Woolworths in Blackburn. And I was up at Doncaster, which is a little bit further from our house, with our daughter. And my wife said, "Can you do the weekly grocery shop?" Okay. Now, sometimes I sit in my car on my phone after I've done a grocery shop, and my wife calls me and say, "Why are you taking so long?" But on this particular occasion, I couldn't find anything in the Woolworths in Doncaster.
Right.
And my wife messaged me, "Why are you taking so long?" And it's like, because bread's not where bread is. Because in my mind's eye, I had a picture, because I know, and I actually do this sometimes at conferences. I say, "Right, tell me who does the shop, right? And which one do you go to?" And they say, "Woolworths here." I say, "Where's the bread?" They'll go, "Aisle 7. Where's the chocolate?" "Aisle 4." Right? You have in your head a mind's eye. So not every Woolworths is mapped out the same. And so there is a map in your head of what that looks like. Or, you get in the car and the indicator goes off because the windscreen wiper's on the other side now, right?
Yeah.
And so we use, the human brain uses shortcuts all the time to help us. And it's discombobulating when it becomes ambiguous as to where things are, and all of a sudden we keep going to the wrong places.
Yeah.
That's cohesion. That's a form of cohesion. I have a level of cohesion with that supermarket. Now, if I keep going to Doncaster, I'll build up a different cohesion. The problem is the learning and the unlearning, right? That's also a form of cohesion. And because if you've done something a lot before, now it becomes the problem, right? If I have a CRM that I'm using in my financial services business, and I change to a new one because it's better, the problem now becomes the old system. And my knowledge of the old system, the longer I've used the old system, the harder it is for me. Whereas there's some kid who's just come straight out of uni who's never used a CRM before, he doesn't have to unlearn.
Yeah.
And all of this have this all the time, and it's moving all the time. We're learning, we're unlearning all the time. And so what I'm trying to do is just put all of that into a number. And that's how we're doing it. And it's really objective. It's not, like I said, whether we like each other. It's not, and I'm not saying that doesn't contribute, but what I'm trying to find is, what can I measure and what can I see, and what does that do?
Yeah. So can you tell us a little bit about the different ingredients of that measurement? Because, of course, cohesion can be between team members, but it can also be related to the environment in which they operate and even the organization in which they operate. They all tie together in a way. How do you measure that?
So I can't obviously go into the human brain, and I can't do questionnaires because we're looking at thousands upon thousands of teams every day. And we also the questionnaires don't always naturally give you the question. I mean, Enron was regarded as the best place to work in America, literally as they were being indicted, right? So
Yeah.
it's right turn of phrase. So that's just not going to necessarily give us the answer. But what I can measure is how long people have done something. I can measure how long people have done something together. I can measure how long they've been in those roles, and I can measure what they've done before. Okay. And each of these components will have a different impact on the performance. I can measure the size of the team. I can measure how long they got at work, right? Like COVID produced some really interesting data for us, because things started to take longer, or it trapped people working together.
Yeah.
And their performance improved, because of that.
Okay.
They were forced into groups they weren't normally part of. They were isolated. It was a really interesting test bed for us, because one thing that we actually find is, when people try to make things better, they generally make things less cohesive. Cohesion is usually driven by disaster, bankruptcy, firings, inadvertent changes that improve systems inherently but weren't meant to do so. I was looking this morning at sporting leagues in Australia, and one of the competitions that's improved dramatically in Australia is the NBL. And it did so because fundamentally they tried to grow it too fast. Too many teams came and went, and it went into chaos. And so they shrank it and stabilized it and made it better. The same things just happened with Super Rugby. They're talking about this being one of the greatest seasons ever because it shrank and stabilized.
Yep.
You sack half your staff, they will inadvertently, the numbers will go up for cohesion. You shrink it, stabilize it, or right size it, as it's often the turn of phrase. But growth, as we talk about a lot, is the enemy of understanding. Trying to grow because you have to hire, trying to grow because you have more people, fundamentally works against the nature of cohesion. So
that's quite an interesting point, because we're at that stage in the Australian superannuation industry where there's a handful of funds that are growing quite quickly. and partly is because of the mandated inflows from superannuation itself, and partly it's because they're starting to do some of the investment functions themselves in-house, so they need to have the expertise in-house.
Yep.
So there's a couple of organizations that literally in a couple of years went from maybe 20, 30 people to hundreds of people, in some cases getting up to 1,000 people. What are some of the dangers of that rapid growth then?
Well, I think the military's got a lot to teach us about growth, and what the military's always done is they've broken themselves up into groups. And if we go back to the notion, I had a really interesting conversation with some of the guys at Platinum and talking about the early days of Platinum. And one of the points they made to us was when there were 6 of us in a room, I could just turn the chair and get the answer, and they would know what even the question was before I answered it. And you can't replicate that in a large organization, right? And so they talked about the growth they had, and then it became too hard to get a room big enough to have the meetings of everybody and no one get heard, right? And then it got harder to bring people into the organization. So the things that you can do in the early days of your success are no longer achievable when you become a corporation, when you become a large organization. So you have to then change the steps of which you go about. You have to have all hands meetings are pretty ineffective. So you have to understand who needs to be in the room. What is the information we want to disseminate? We're going to have to give everybody this information first, whatever it might be. And we've been working in Formula One, and one of the teams that had been highly stable for a number of years, we said to them, "Do you have an org chart?" And they said, "No, we don't have one." It's like, why? It's because we never needed one, because everyone knew where they were supposed to be. Yeah. Now we've taken on a whole bunch of people. Everyone's asking for an org chart, and we're like, okay, maybe we do need one right now. So growth will have to drive a change of the processes. I think one of the mistakes that early startup businesses make is they try to introduce the processes that large organizations have when they don't actually need them. We had an investor come into us and say, you need to do this, this, and this. And it's like, have all your notes taken for meetings, and, you and your business partner, Simon, need to process everything so you can communicate properly. I'm like, but he hears my conversations because he's at the desk next to me.
Yeah.
Right? And we talk every day because he drives me to work. Yeah. We don't need some of these processes that we think we need. So I think right-sizing process is a really important point. If you then break your company up into different divisions, the danger then becomes that different divisions will divert in their behavior from one another, right? So then you build a set of offices all around Australia. And I don't know if you remember the McDonald's movie they made about the founder.
No.
The early days of McDonald's, they would build different ones around the country, and they'd come across, and like some of them were serving fried chicken. Yeah. Like completely deviating from the processes that made the organization successful in the first place. So having the processes that allowed you to maintain cohesion, because if you just become an amorphous mass, you have chaos, right? Yeah. But if you break yourself up, it comes with its own challenges of deviation of behavior. So there's all of these things, and like I say, growth is really, really hard.
Yeah. Is there sort of a optimum size? Because there is this concept that's often used within sort of corporate culture-focused strategies, and it's a concept borrowed from anthropology, where they say, once an organization grows beyond 150 people, it's no longer possible to know everyone within the company, and sort of the idea that maybe in the olden days, tribes were consisted of no more than 150 people, and after that they would split off. Is there sort of a sweet spot there?
It entirely depends on what you're trying to do, and the complexity or the simplification of the task that is required. Military always tend to say once you go beyond 6, it gets really hard. But I'd just say mathematically, it just, as it grows out, it gets harder, and you get less time. Okay, so to use sport, a doubles tennis team can probably learn to play together very, very quickly, but a basketball team takes longer. A symphony takes longer. An AFL team takes longer. But if you take a symphony, for example, there's different parts of that symphony. There's the violin section, and they can take cues off one another. So it's always context, and it also, we need to understand what is the context of performance. Okay, So to win the A-League, you don't actually need a lot of stability. You saw the success that Auckland FC have had in their first year with some limited, what we call externally shared experience, prior shared experience with New Zealand. But the A-League is not a very cohesive league. To win the Champions League, we were looking at the most cohesive team that's ever existed in the Champions League, and I think it was Real Madrid in 2018, and the numbers were extraordinary because they're up against other teams with money and cohesion, such as the formerly Manchester United used to be, or Ajax, for example. They're really well-built clubs, and so it all depends on what your notion of good looks like. And to give an example, there's a group of jet fighter pilots in the US, and they have called the Blue Eagles. I'm going to get that wrong. Maybe we can correct me. I apologize, but I watched a documentary on them, and they rotate new teams every sort of 2 years.
Yeah,
they have a level of closeness they can get to each other in formation that at the start of the year they won't even attempt. So they're trying to get inside 5 meters, and they're trying to get inside 1 meter from each other, and they slowly progress through the year. That by the end, if they can get to less than 1 meter from each other, then they're in a fantastic place. But they don't attempt that at the end. So that's what their good looks like. If your good is inside 10 meters, you can probably do it in a couple of weeks.
Yeah.
So, and also depends on what are we up against. So the AFL is the highest stability league in the world. And part of that is that their teams are so stable that even to get competitive in that league takes 5 years, right? Whereas the A-League, 6 months, 3 months. You can make you into competitive. So none of this is A or B or black and white. It's like there's levels of this. And the other part is too is what are you doing? How much complexity does this job require? How much complexity does this task need that how we have to work together in order to get to a level of success?
Yeah. You also make the difference between cohesion and culture. Culture is something that I think is increasingly more on the agenda because if you have a good culture, then a lot of benefits stem from that, and it's increasingly seen as not just like a soft skill, but it's an important way of creating a sustainable business. But it's not the same as cohesion. Can you explain that a bit?
Well, I think one of the challenges that we see, particularly in sport, is it's very difficult for people sometimes to understand success or failure. And so they'll say, why is this team so great? Because, they've had a lot of success. And I go, okay, well, they've got a great coach. And then that coach will leave. So, for example, if we use football, Liverpool, right? They had a great coach in Klopp. He left. The new coach comes in and is like, well, it's going to take a long time to recover. And they won the league in the first year, right? And so it's like, okay, well, maybe it wasn't him. Maybe it was something else. So then what they go is, okay, well, the club's got a great culture. Now, one of the things I might find is when teams are winning, people do point to them having a great culture. But my experience, and particularly when I was at the Brumbies, we were just as much of a set of rat bags, if not worse, than anyone else, right? But people wouldn't believe me. They would say, how are you? Your team's winning, therefore must have a great culture. And I'm like, have you met our players? Right? Have you been with us on end of season trips? Like, we're just as badly behaved as anyone else. But one thing that happens, and I'm lived in Newcastle quite a lot, and one thing I would find is if the team was winning, the town would protect them.
Right.
Right. They would hide the behavior of the players. Oh, boys will be boys. When teams are losing, you're on your own now. All the bad behavior comes out. So in terms, what I find behaviorally is that if teams are winning, the bad behavior takes longer to get out, but it's still there. Right? Now, the next part is, what is culture? I mean, what do you believe culture to be?
Well, I actually have a background in anthropology, and that's probably the most discussed question in anthropology. And to my knowledge, they never really came up with one definition of it. But basically it has to do with a set of relationship, a set of customs, and sort of historic knowledge of those type of interactions.
So one way of describing it might be, for example, normative behaviors.
Yeah.
Right. Well, you cannot achieve normative behaviors with a bunch of people thrown together. Right. You get chaos. I talk of it as like being like a refugee camp. A whole bunch of different, influences and a mishmash of different cultures, so to speak, different sets of behaviors. You throw them in together, and then what happens is the environment will then drive the behaviors, right? And you keep people together long enough, and that will start to become a normative behavior. So, for example, in small towns, if you and I move to a small town, because we all have to see each other every day, you say hello to each other every day, right? You take care of your neighbor, right? Because we know that's the best thing for us to do in terms of our survival in the town, is not to foster a bad reputation in terms of our interpersonal behavior amongst one another. So we become more service orientated towards other people in the town. Now, the driver of our behavior then is actually the size of the town, right? So I see culture oftentimes as an outcome of the circumstances in which that team exists. So small teams will build understanding faster. Their normative behaviors will be adapted to quicker. And then, for example, if you set in place rewards, like this is why we had a Royal Commission in financial services, right? You build certain rewards, people start behaving in certain ways. But if you and I go from that small town into a city, we cannot say hello to everyone. We cannot look after everyone. It will destroy us, right? So you stop saying hello to everyone. And again, that's an outcome. So I see oftentimes culture, the normative behaviors, as an outcome of the drivers, right? And those normative behaviors sometimes are good, and sometimes they're not very good. And an example I give sometimes is, there was a team in the AFL called the West Coast Eagles who were very well known. I was living in Perth at the time, for their off-field behaviour. And one of the players recently went to jail and said, as part of his criminal case, I was told by the senior players, if you're not going to take gear with us or smoke crystal meth with us, then you're not going to be part of this team. So he did it. And the team played well. They won the grand final. They made the finals 16 of 19 years, and they're in the comp, or 16 of 18 years. And they won 3 grand finals, and they were very, very successful. Now, a lot of those players then left off the back of that, and the cohesion dropped away, and they're now stuck in a bit of a hole themselves, and they're not getting great outcomes. So I think one of the challenges is if culture is the normative behaviors, sometimes those normative behaviors are driven by the conditions under which they are built, but also part of those conditions is the amount of turnover that you have in that environment. And so I think there can be, with the background that you have, and I don't have degrees in this, right? I'm just trying to be as objective as I can be. But I think there are times when we mistake behaviors for causality, right? So, and I'll give you an example. They did a study on hugging in the NBA.
Yeah.
And they found that the teams who are hugging each other were winning, right? And we know that hugging gives you oxytocin, makes you feel good. And they thought that might be at the heart of success. So they coded it, and they looked at the teams who are hugging before the games and touching each other on the bum and all this sort of stuff and high-fiving and saying, well, maybe this is affecting their performance. And there's a link. There's a link between doing it and success. But if you then go and say to a team, you need to hug each other more, right, which is what then happened, and teams I've been associated with started doing it, it wasn't going very well because the players were not comfortable to do it.
Yeah.
What was actually taking place is the teams had been together for a long period of time, knew each other, and the hugging, like if you saw me on the street now, we wouldn't hug, right? We're not quite there yet.
Yeah.
Maybe we have coffee 10 times. The 10th time we'll have a hug, okay?
Yeah.
But we would have built understanding over that period of time. That is what I believe was taking place, is that the teams who, by product of being together for a long time, knew each other, therefore they were hugging, but that was not a driver of the outcome. And I think that a lot of these ideas around culture are built on that. Now, if I might divert, I mentioned to you earlier I had a story about culture.
Yes.
So in the world of Twitter, I cop quite a bit sometimes, and there was a turn of phrase that comes up quite a bit. And I've even had this. I met with a guy who was part of the Big Four, and he said, I believe that cohesion can have a profound impact on performance. And he said, well, what about culture and strategy for breakfast? I was like, yeah, it's a phrase, right? So that phrase has been attributed to Peter Drucker.
Yes.
Okay? And so this person on Twitter was saying culture is strategy for breakfast, therefore you're wrong. I'm like, okay, so I wanted to look it up. And so I looked up that there is actually a Drucker Institute.
Yeah.
And someone had put on Twitter that the Drucker Institute on the front page has Cohesion eats strategy for breakfast. I'm like, okay, well, if they're writing it, then he must have said it. So I then went and found this other podcast where they said we looked into everything Drucker ever said, and he never said it, but he did say, I'm paraphrasing here, culture is extremely difficult to shift.
Yeah.
Which I definitely agree with. And so I emailed one of the university professors. Now, I don't have a degree, and I'm always very intimidated by dealing with anyone who has university degrees and professors. And my mum actually has a master's in ancient history and archaeology. But one thing I've always been interested in is like, the whole thing about peer review and about research and, writing bibliographies. Okay. So I emailed this guy and who had written this piece for the Drucker Institute. And I said, did you know Drucker never said that? And he said, to be honest with you, I never thought to check. I just Googled it. And in Google, it says he said it. So I put it on the front of it. And then all of these other university professors came onto this email chain. And then one of them came out and said, no, here's the guy who said it. Someone from MIT. Drucker never said this. And there was all these kind of people saying, okay, well, maybe we're not mistaken. I was like stunned because if there's anyone ever that makes sure they do research, it's university professors. And even they were falling into the trap that we all do, of course, which is you just Google it and that makes sense.
Yeah, he is shorthand. Yeah.
Yeah, and so I think that happens a lot. There's so many phrases that people use and say, okay, well, that phrase is the evidence. Like maybe it's not even the case. We just say it, right?
Yeah, yeah. It's just a way to quickly come to conclusions. I think
Yeah.
there's a whole range of quotes attributed to Einstein, to Mark Twain, to Keynes, that all things that they've never said, but they're still good quotes.
Yeah, one of my favorites is that no one ever built a statue to a critic, and Roger Ebert, the film critic, actually has a statue of him sitting there. So it's one of my favorite ones.
That's great. That's great. So you mentioned earlier there as well, like turnover. So when we go to this concept of cohesion is driving performance, is it possible to build cohesion in a team or in an organization that has a high level of turnover?
So again, there's a nuance to this, which is one, what are you up against? The team that has the least turnover, will probably build the most levels of cohesion. I think one of the key components here is where are you drawing your talent from and what has that talent done before?
Yep.
So there's different components to people. And if I just give the easy example of if I take somebody who's been part of Magellan for a period of time and then they come across to a platinum, they're going to bring things with them. They're going to bring previous experience, they're going to bring biases, and they're going to bring fantastic information. But what's important to understand is that it's different, and that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work at your other organization. And I apologize, I probably said the completely wrong thing in terms of organizations, but the point being that it's not just turnover, it's also from where you grab your talent. The position, one thing we find very much in sport is certain positions require understanding or less or more understanding. The context of the group of what you're going into. So when we looked at football, so Groisberg said that he felt that the research he did on Morgan Stanley, the research he did on Morgan Stanley said it took someone 3.5 years to peak performance. We did the same thing in the EPL, and the answer was 2.9 seasons. But it was conditional. One, where are you coming from? Mm-hmm. Where are you going to? What is the state of the team you're entering? The more stable the team you enter into, the greater the chance you have of performing well. There's a turn of phrase called the Bayern Munich mirage. So what you're coming from is what I'm talking about here is they say that in football, if you leave Bayern Munich, you'll never be the same again because they have had, particularly 2010s, had a period of high level of sustained stability, which went on to the German national team. And so if you leave that environment, you won't be able to, and that's attribution bias, right? You won't be able to perform to the same standard. And then different parts. So strikers, for example, it's easier for them to change clubs than midfielders because that's the management position, right? And each industry will be affected in different ways. Generally, in rugby, cohesion manifests itself in defense. I've just been working on the NFL, and it actually works itself in attack because you have to work together more on attack than you do in defense. So each part will have a different component, each position will have a different component. And then you slowly start to work out what those different parts are.
So within corporate teams, what would sort of be, quick and easy wins for people to build cohesion?
So the first thing we always begin with is, what am I looking at? What I mean by that is that we tend to all attribute performance with that term attribution bias to the individual. And to try to understand as best we can, what is creating this success or failure in this person? And so if they have come from another system, what are they struggling to adapt to? So, and we're not saying don't bring people in from other places. That's fantastic. But if they've been using a different CRM, for example, a different organization, they're going to struggle with yours, right? So they're going to take 3 times as long, and they're going to take longer than the kid you just got out of university. But there's some things that this person knows that that kid doesn't know. So the juice might be worth the squeeze in this particular case. So we need to give them more time. So don't compare the young person to the older person. So the first thing is the context of the individual's performance. The second part is the context of the team. They might have gone in to an A team, right? So you go in to play for the Melbourne Storms of the world, and people generally perform well, okay? Whereas, and different teams inside your organization will be built differently. And then if I use the rugby league turn of phrase, you then go to play for a West Tigers, you then don't generally perform well, okay? But you need to understand that performance in that context. What is the context of how they're performing? Why are they performing the way they are? And then also understand that turnover is never black and white. So, and to give an easy example, everyone's got choices all the time. And organizations will say to us, we're so unlucky. We've had so many people decide to travel in the same year, or so many people decide to have kids, okay? Now, my wife and I have 4 kids, and, there's certain points in time where my wife's like, I'm not enjoying work. Why don't we just have another kid, right? So so sometimes people might decide not to have another child or not travel because they're enjoying work so much they don't want to lose their opportunity at the organization they're in. Or they start to think, I'm not enjoying myself, so I might go and do something else, or, get picked up. So turnover is turnover in my mind, right? In sport, yes, you have injuries, whatever it might be, but if people are doing things they haven't done before, sometimes they're more likely to get injured. So I think it's really important to look at the context of what you're ending up with, and why are we losing people so much, or why are we gaining people so much? And I always say, like, just because somebody, if somebody is creating turnover in their behavior, then you probably need to exit that person. So it's not saying don't ever have people leave. And once we understand what we're looking at, and once we understand the decisions we're making, and to look at turnover in a very opaque level, then the thing is to understand, okay, what changes am I looking to make, and what is the speed of that change? And one thing that does also happen is that people are always going to be their own biggest fans. With sport, we know it, the parents, right? The parents are going to, so we talk about, if you import talent above someone else, the people below will leave. We talk about sign 1, lose 3. And to give a very easy turn of phrase, let's say, in a business perspective, you sign a very talented 50-year-old and you lose 2 30-year-olds, right? That 50-year-old comes with you for 5 years and he does okay, but the two 30-year-olds have gone off and started another firm, which is now one of your competitors against you. So you lose those 2 guys. The 50-year-old then leaves, and you're like, we don't have those next guys ready to go because those 2 30-year-olds left. So because we don't have anyone with that level of talent, HR, go find someone for me tomorrow. That person comes in, and then they introduce a new CRM that all of a sudden 10 of your people are now underperforming. And so he says, I need to sack 5 of those guys. I need to bring people with the last organization we're in. And then away you go, right? There's a whole, we talk about the tumble down effect. One change creates more change, creates more change. So there always needs to be a context of, if I'm going to get talent, what is that talent? And even if that person is the nicest person in the planet, and I've been that guy and you've been that guy, and this is not about people being good or bad. It's just, what is the context here of what will this do?
Yeah.
And so that is not necessarily thought about enough, I'd say.
Yeah, I think there was an interesting slide as well that you put up at your presentation where it showed the interconnectedness between different employees. So if you remove one person, it might affect, say, 4 or 5 relationships, or maybe a bit more. But if you remove 4 or 5 people, then suddenly it starts escalating, because there's sort of, this almost compounding interest type of relationship where you remove a handful of people and it can affect up to 50, 60 different type of relationships, and that's much harder to deal with and to replace than just with the single individual. Can you explain that a bit more?
Yeah, so literally, I believe sometimes multinationals can be brought down by these sort of things, right? Can I use a sporting example? Is that
Yeah,
okay?
of course. Yeah.
Okay, so Sir Alex Ferguson had this really interesting impact on football. When he was coaching, people inadvertently were having a bias towards Scottish coaches. There was 9 Scottish coaches in the top 2 divisions of English football. There's now 1. But when he was coaching, everyone believed he was that was maybe part of the deal, right? They'd hear a Scottish accent, they go, okay, we want that. So when he left, and they brought in Moyes, who was also Scottish, who was having success at Everton. Okay. Now, this is from the best I can glean, and we have some insights and some people we work with in football that can help us with a lot of this. So we're not just guessing. But one of the things Ferguson did was like, don't change too much. And then Moyes wanted to introduce the things he did at Everton to the group. So he didn't change the team, but he changed the way they played.
Mm-hmm.
So now that group is, and also understanding that Ferguson had been able to weather the storm of the new ownership of the club, right? Which is, we know what's going on now with Man U. And we're now at the peak point of that tumble down effect. It's now at the end of its cycle. Moyes changed the way they played, and the players could not adapt fast enough to the way he wanted to play. So his response was going to be, okay, well, I'm going to bring in people who can.
Right.
And I remember talking to somebody at Man U at the time saying they're completely changing how we recruit now to match this new way of playing. Right. So now that doesn't work. They move him on, and then they bring in another coach. And my memory's going to fail me here. They bring in another coach who has the German style, for example, of coaching, or Dutch style of coaching. And that guy comes in, and now all their recruiters are recruiting to the wrong model because they're recruiting to the Everton model.
Yep.
Now they've got to change again. Now they're not quite sure what they're supposed to be looking for. And then they gut half the team. And so the cohesion numbers are just dropping and dropping and dropping. And they've been dropping ever since. And so they're spending money to bring in the new talent because the talent they just acquired is not performing very well. And so everyone says the biggest problem at Man U is recruitment. Okay. So that doesn't work. So they go another coach again. They go another coach again. But the ownership at this point is just trying to squeeze every dollar they can out of the organization. And so we keep having to buy to find the answer, which is creating less stability. Now, one of the biggest drivers of skill acquisition is stability. If I'm dealing with constant change, I don't get better because I'm spending all my time adapting to new environments, right? And so those young people come into a bed of chaos. They don't become good at what they do, so they can't create talent to sell, and it just has that tumble down effect. So it can literally begin with one thing, which is maybe Scottish coaches are great. Let's get Moyes, to all of a sudden now the club is basically having to sell its entire list. And the hardest part now is, it's very difficult to have a conversation with somebody at that level of crisis. You want to stop it at the head and say, just think about what you do next, right? Because the way we describe cohesion is it can drop 50% in a week, but it can't grow 50% in a week. It grows 5% a year.
Right.
So it grows slow, but can be destroyed fast, like building a house, right? Can't build a house fast, but you can knock one over pretty quickly. So that kind of small components can lead to underperformance, which will lead to more change, which will lead to greater underperformance. And now you get chaos clouding causality, right? And so what they tend to do is, we need to go get the players who are playing well somewhere else, who then don't play well for you, or we go get a coach who's coaching well somewhere else. And the classic in rugby league at the moment is you go and get the assistant coach from the great club, and they don't necessarily perform to the same level. It happens everywhere all the time.
Yeah.
Right?
So do you think there are learnings in that for mergers and acquisitions in the corporate world? We see currently within the superannuation system, there's lots of funds that are merging. Some of them are very different organizations, come from different industries. How you bring that together is quite tricky. And sometimes it's better, especially in corporate acquisitions, they don't always add value, and more often than not, they don't add value. Is there some learnings there that makes perhaps easier to do mergers?
This answer I could give you could take 3 hours, right? But one thing that happens is when we look at sporting teams who merge, it's not that common, but the Waratahs just went through it in rugby. I hope you don't mind I use that as an example.
No, go for it.
You take a bunch of people somewhere else, you bring them together. And so basically with the Waratahs this year, they're a merger of a team that just faltered, which is the Melbourne Rebels. They bring a bunch of kids in, right? Now, one of the things you want to create in any system is you want people coming through the system together from the university graduates through, well, let's call it your academy or, the floor where guys are working together and they become the senior guys. And all of that knowledge and time helps to protect the business from whatever it might be. So the problem is when you have a merge is everyone who's coming up through your system will have never been with any of those people before. So it doesn't just hit you when you have that merge, because you have those people come in with shared experience together, but none of them have worked with anyone else. So over the next couple of years, what will tend to happen is the people who come in together from somewhere else will tend to stick together and then leave together. So one of them goes, they all go, right?
Yep.
Because why would they be loyal? If you join an organization and let's say you've been there for 25 years and they say, we've just hit COVID, could you take a pay cut? Your wife's going to say to you, they've looked after us, let's look after them, right?
Yep.
If you've been at one for 6 months and you come in and they say you need to take a pay cut, your wife's going to say to you, why are we being loyal to this organization? Because we don't know if they're going to be loyal to us. It's not that you don't trust them, it's just you don't know them.
Yeah.
There's no pattern of previous behavior. So you're going to act quite differently. And that's just loyalty to family. There's no good loyalty or bad loyalty, just different types of it. So that's the first component. The next component is you're merging different systems upon each other, right? So there's different types of mergers. If you're buying a business for a technology, that's just the system you're bringing in, but you're not bringing in the people who administer that system. And so it's when you merge people together and systems together with those people at the same time, that tends to become a problem. Mm. If you own a mine and you're just buying a hole in the ground, have at it, right? So there's different types of mergers that we look at. And then there's things like vertical acquisitions. But, all of the research that I found so far is telling me that economies of scale is a vastly overrated issue. Just leave things as they were, for the love of God. And when people do that, that tends to be more successful over time.
Yeah.
But how you do it, how you go about that process, and of course size. So I'm not saying mergers and acquisitions are going to be successful or unsuccessful, but there are certain ones that we look at and go, this is not going to work at all. Now, there's another form of merger which can take place sometimes, which is like if you import a CEO from one of your competitors and he brings a whole bunch of people with him, you're fundamentally merging the company. If you look at Borghetti, when he went to Virgin Airlines, he basically brought Qantas with him, and it was a merger, but not in name.
Yeah.
And so that has its own components of outcome, so to speak.
Yeah, for sure. One concept that I find quite intriguing as well that is related to this is the idea of knowledge management within an organization. And so there's been studies done into this, whether you can sort of retain a form of institutional memory so that you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time teams change or senior management changes, but whether you can sort of codify this for new people to quickly access, see how things are done, what the history is of certain perhaps transactions or certain techniques that they use, and get up to speed really, really quickly. Do you think that is possible to then also help improve the cohesion, that you have sort of this knowledge base that you can tap into and very quickly understand how an organization functions?
I think I was looking at a study the other day, and I'm not going to quote it directly, but it was talking about most knowledge acquisitions done was 80% of the time it's done on an informal level. It's the conversations at the water cooler, so to speak. So I think that you can optimize that structurally. I'm really interested in German companies, the way the German boards are built, in that you have to have people who are on the floor. and I was, looking at Mercedes and BMW, and you look at the CVs of their board members, and they're like, you know, Gert began as a 15-year-old intern with BMW, right? And you think about when a decision is thrust upon an organization, like we're going to switch to this type of tool set, and Gert can say, I remember we did that in 78, 91, 07, and 14. And it only worked once because of these were the circumstances. We did it slowly, whatever it might be.
Yeah.
So I think that creating structures that retain institutional knowledge is the most important component of that. And then I think that the way that Australian companies are generally built is this kind of, I'm not going to call it a plague, this kind of scenario of non-executive directors on the board, the adults in the room, so to speak, and there's different forms of them, absolutely, and they provide a fantastic service. But I think there's always a danger if you have a CEO who is the main font of that knowledge and memory, right? Is you need that memory on your board. I think it's extremely important because when the big decisions come, and I remember talking to a board in the AFL, and we presented to them and they said, this was so good. You should have been here 5 years ago. And I said, I was, but none of you were in the room, right? And now we're still having the same conversation, right?
Yeah.
5 years later.
Yeah.
Which can be, we never name, we don't, some companies we work with name us, but we don't tend to name who we work with, except if I'm sort of presenting to a room, but we won't put it up publicly for a whole bunch of reasons, because sometimes they just don't listen at all.
Yeah.
And one of the questions I actually have for board members is, why are you on the board? Are you on the board so you can tell your mates? Are you on the board? And would you be comfortable for this company or team to fail, while you're here, but be successful later? And you not to get any of the responsibility for that? Like, what's the most important thing out of this? If you're not winning today, but you're winning in 5 years' time permanently, and I've actually got this idea about coaches, which is that coaches should be rewarded, but only for the wins they have 5 years after they retire.
Yeah.
Because you want them to be thinking about that, about how they set up the team for success further down the track, and that needs to be their kind of be all and end all in a way, because otherwise you're just self-interest, right? The nature of our work is trying to understand self-interest, and I've had scenarios where we've talked to coaches and they've said, one, I don't have any permission to do what you think we should do. That's fine. So maybe we need to have a different conversation about this, about how we have success. But also is that sometimes people want organizations to fail after they leave.
Yeah.
But they don't want to set up for long-term success for a whole range of reasons, right? Revenge is pretty sweet sometimes. So it needs to be about who is the person who's looking after the long-term success and isn't thinking about self-interest. And I think a lot of self-interest is inadvertent. The other part is, and I'll say this, and put this to other, it can't just be about sport, is that we've been presenting to coaches who are performing extraordinarily well, and we are actually saying, you need to understand you are not necessarily the coach you believe yourself to be.
Or the reason for success.
Yeah. And so they're like, get out of my office, right? Because they're renegotiating their lease. In fact, there's a great study I just saw from the University of California. I'm going to get this wrong. They did on Monopoly. And what they did is they flipped a coin at the start of the game, and the person who landed on heads, they got 2 dice and got 200 every time they passed go.
Yeah.
And the person who had tails got $100 and they got 1 dice. So they weren't going around as fast. And so inevitably the person who had heads would win.
Yep. And
they did it 180 to 80 something times. And the person with the heads, I think, won all of them. And they would start talking down to the other person, right?
Yeah.
It'd start sort of cheating. Did I present this at the conference?
Yeah, you did.
Yeah.
There was some videos where you can see them just becoming more and more rude towards the other person.
And they asked the person at the end, why did you win? And none of them pointed to the coin flip. Okay.
Yeah.
That's coaching.
Yeah.
No one wants to know when the coins are stacked in their favor, so to speak, or the dice are stacked in their favor.
That's a big discussion also in the investment industry, right? When you have successful fund managers, are they just lucky, or are they actually doing something that is better and repeatable, or is it just how the market's played out? Because often you see that investment decisions are made and implemented for entirely different reasons than what it's played out to be, even if it's a successful trade. And I think there's a sort of a famous example that we've heard is where a fund basically took a position based on the idea that Hillary Clinton was going to win the US elections over Trump. And of course, Trump won. But the rationale behind the trade was, well, if Hillary wins, it's great for markets and we're going to make money out of this. Well, Trump won and the market still went up. So they still made money, but for completely the wrong reason.
Yeah.
So is that luck? Is that skill?
Well, the thing is too, is that then what happens is because you've theoretically now good at what you do, then you get the good trades, right? You get the good information comes to you, particularly in startup investment. The other thing, and I might be wrong about this, but I believe there was a report out of a company that had, like online trading, and they found the best investors were people who'd either died or lost their login because they weren't making any changes, right?
Well, there's definitely a correlation to super funds there, because some super funds offer their members self-directed options where they have a certain percentage, and it can be quite high, it's up to 60 or 70% of their portfolio, that they can invest themselves, and they can invest it in single names, also within bandwidths. And invariably, they do way worse than their just default option. Because they just chop and change and incur fees and, get out of trades at the wrong time or get into trades at the wrong time. And usually it is driven by trying to chase return, and you're always too late when you do that. So there's definitely a correlation there as well.
Yeah.
Maybe to sort of finish up, what are you working on towards future research? Any new areas that you're looking at?
I'm a really big believer in the turn of phrase. I think it's the stonemason's creed. You keep hitting the same spot, and if you want to break the stone, it's the 100th hit that breaks the stone, right? Mm-hmm. So, and everyone forgets the first 99. They go, wow, what a great blow. And it's like, it doesn't work like that. You have to keep going at it. So what I'm finding is the more we look at the work, the more we keep focusing on the same thing, the more we discover. So it's more of an iteration. And I think about guys, who make the samurai swords.
Yeah.
They do it for 30 years and they can understand, okay, well, if I do this many folds of the metal, it creates this grain. And if I stoke the fire in this way, and so you make mistakes and you improve it, and you make mistakes and you improve it. What we're trying to do at the moment is in all of the systems we're trying to break it. Keep trying to break it and find, okay, so what does the Auckland Football Club, for example, doing well in their first year, what does that tell us? So what's the truth of performance? That always keeps coming back to for us. What is the truth of performance? And I think one of the great challenges is to keep on questioning the way things are done, particularly in trying to prove things out. And I think through conversations with my mum and that experience with the Peter Drucker experience, it tells me that just because something is studied and done doesn't necessarily mean they're getting it right. And that applies for us too. And we need to look at things again and again in the most objective way we can say, and begin with, okay, what do we actually know? And everything else is on the outer until we really feel like we can prove this out. What I would say is that we're slowly but surely expanding the different things in which we're looking from and learning. But for me, there are accountancy firms who are the Canterbury Crusaders of accountancy firms, and there are accountancy firms who are the West Tigers of accountancy firms, and they have more in common with each other, right, than they do the other accountancy firm, right? And I think one thing that is quite interesting is how all of this comes from governance and where it begins from. And I think a structure of governance is where I'm kind of looking at it a lot at the moment. You create conditions. There's a great example of this in rugby league. So the Parramatta Eels had a lot of success in the 80s and 90s. Not perfect by any stretch, but I think they won 58% of the games. And they decided, because of fundamentally the dominance of one person in the club, to kind of limit the tenure on their board. And by simply limiting the tenure of their board, they then went through like 11 CEOs and 9 different coaches in 25 years and went from 58% winning record to 36% winning record, because everyone wanted that success inside of that tenure, right?
Yeah.
So for me, it's what do structures do through good decisions and what are the long-term ramifications of those structures, and then how can we create structures. And the other part that I think I'm really learning is that, we go to this notion of good and bad culture and good and bad people, but kind of everyone fundamentally, I think, believes they're doing the right thing most of the time. They just have a different version of what a good thing looks like.
Yeah.
And so, we've had so many different conversations with organizations. We've just been like, my God, you look incompetent, but they're not incompetent. They're just dealing with a really difficult structure that's making them appear to be incompetent, or also maybe they're making them appear to be extremely competent. Okay.
Yeah.
And let's not over believe that they are necessarily fantastic at what they do. Maybe it's the scenario of that. So there's an evolving view for us that cohesion is an outcome as well of other components.
Yep.
And it has obviously a set of ramifications, but everyone's doing their best.
Yeah. So it's not simply a matter of sending somebody, a team away a weekend to do some team building exercises, play ultimate frisbee, and they come back star investors.
Well, unless your job is to play ultimate frisbee, that would work. But I'm literally having this conversation right now internally, about what that stuff does. I think developing interpersonal trust is great. I think developing clarity is better. I think doing the thing you're supposed to be doing is best, right? You're better to just get that process right first. Then the fun comes later. If I walk into an office, I see a table tennis table, I walk straight back out the door. I have no interest. People just put stuff on it, right? And it's noisy. Get rid of it.
Yeah, fair enough. Well, Ben, we could talk about this for another few hours, but you've been very generous with your time, so I'll let you go. But thanks very much for this conversation. It was fascinating.
It's an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the i3 podcast. For more information, please visit our website at www.i3, that's the letter I, the number 3, -invest.com. And don't forget to like, subscribe and review. Thank you very much.